Well, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. I would like to thank Nancy and Candy. I would especially like to thank Christo for helping me put together my PowerPoint image presentation, saving me at the last minute. And I'd also like to thank Joanne Geddes, who is my colleague at Lewis & Clark, who actually first invited me to give this talk and also the one that I'll be giving a little bit later this month at the Lake Oswego Public Library, which is more specific to the themes in the novel of the series, Honor by Triti Umragar. And that talk is titled Law, Power, and Tradition in Modern India. So it'll be a little bit that I'll be talking about here that I'll cover then, but there'll be two different talks. So where to begin? The biggest challenge in this talk is keeping it within the time limit and having it be coherent, because everything that I could talk about relating to modern India, we're only scratching the surface. There's so much more on each of these topics. So I guess I'll start the way that I start a course that I teach at Lewis & Clark on India. For students who might have had a little bit of background, some of our students in Lewis & Clark are actually from South Asia, so they know quite a bit about the country that I don't know. But some of them have no familiarity with India at all. If you want to get a sense of the complexity and the diversity of India, try to imagine if you took all of Europe, from the Ural Mountains in the east in Russia, all the way to the Atlantic coast of Portugal, right? And then from the Arctic reaches of Norway, all the way down to Malta and Sicily in the south. And if you made that all one country, India would still be more ethnically, culturally, and linguistically diverse. And to give you a bit of evidence of that, I have a historical artifact. This is a 50 rupee note worth about $1.10 at the latest exchange rate. And it shows the 15 official languages of India, except that it's inaccurate. There are 26 official languages in India. This note is from 1992. They've added more and more. Official languages are languages where you can conduct official government business. Unofficially, there are hundreds of languages in India. It's very, very hard for people who go to India to get a sense of just how complex the history, how deep the civilization, how controversial a lot of things that we wouldn't even think about in this country are. So I will pass this around. You can take a closer look at it. The languages are not only different languages, but they're in different scripts, and some of the languages are completely unrelated to each other. So for example, Hindi is linguistically closer to English, the other official language of India, than it is to the languages in the south of India, which are different language families altogether. So what I'd like to do now is just start to talk a little bit about the importance of India. India has always been an important country. India as a civilization has been more central to world history than Europe has. Europe only took on a role of centrality in world history from about the year 1500 onward when it expanded outward. India is the world's largest country by population. India is the world's largest democracy. India is becoming rapidly, it already is, but it's continuing its ascent as a major superpower. At last check, according to the World Economic Forum, it has the 5th largest economy in the world, having surpassed the economy of Great Britain last year. That's a special mark for the people of India. The growth rate in the fiscal year of 2022-23 was a whopping 7.2%. That would be the envy of most countries, this country in particular. And it accounted for 15 or 16% of total global growth in 2023. It had the second highest growth, economic growth of the G20 in 2023. It also hosted the G20 as well. On top of that, it's a rising military and naval superpower, a regional power in the Indian Ocean, and also a nuclear superpower since 1998, although it actually developed its nuclear program decades earlier. And as we might know in this country, the soft power of India is as significant as its hard power. India defines world culture in music, in fashion, in cuisine, in sport, that is if you're a cricket fan, in cinema certainly, with the largest film industry in the entire world, and that's something that it's had for decades. So India is a country that's on its ascent. As a civilization, it has some of the deepest roots in the human experience, but it's a country that other countries are paying more attention to, especially the United States, because there's an Indian diaspora in the United States that's been here since the 19th century, but has also grown in significance and influence. So a state visit from India in the year 2024 would be a much bigger occasion and certainly get more attention in US politics than it would have back in the 50s or 60s when the state visits began. So let's begin. There we go. At the start of the 20th century, India was ruled as a crown colony of the United Kingdom. It was the center, often called a jewel in the crown, of the empire, to take the name of that famous novel by Paul Scott. And psychologically, it was very important to Britain as well, because Britain was, in terms of its military power and its economic power, actually declining relative to other countries like Germany, the United States, even Japan, its ascent in the 20th century. So the empire played a very important role psychologically. Before 1858, India had been ruled by the East India Company, which was a private concession, very controversial organization to be sure. And after 1858, it was a direct crown colony with a viceroy that represented the king or the queen. And after 1877, the Queen of England and the Empress of India. And so this is the coronation durbar in New Delhi for King George V. This is the grandfather of the recently departed Queen Elizabeth II, who became the Emperor of India in a ceremony that was much more lavish than his coronation as king in Westminster Abbey in London. India was ruled autocratically. It had a top-down government and an executive style, and a fairly authoritarian system of government that in many ways resembled much more the empires of India prior to colonial rule than it did the Westminster system of parliamentary democracy, which post-colonial India would later adopt. But it was a system that it couldn't be called a dictatorship. The viceroys of India, the governors general, their powers were limited, and there were certain representative institutions in India at the end of the 19th century. But these institutions were often granting greater or devolving greater power at a rate that was not satisfying Indians who wanted a much greater share in the control of their own country, and some Indians who just wanted the British to depart altogether. It was a colonial relationship, an imperial relationship, and there have been empires throughout history. And often we think of empires as merely about conquest and exploitation. Certainly that was true with the British in India. But it wasn't merely the colonizers stamping their economic order and their political control and their culture and their language upon a passive population. It was actually much more of a dependent relationship. And the British came to depend upon India to the point where one might argue, I make this case in some of the things that I've written, and certainly when I discuss this with students, but then in some ways Britain was much more profoundly affected by its relationship historically with India than India was by Britain. Look who the Prime Minister of Britain is now. Just go to a city like London or Liverpool or Sheffield or Edinburgh or Manchester, or just the list goes on. And just look at the people that you see in the street. Ride the tube in London. You'll see that Britain is a very multiracial society of citizens who are British by birth, but who actually come from other parts of the world, the former empire, and in particular South Asia. At the time that the empire still existed, Britain was very heavily dependent upon the Indian Army, the second largest army in the Indian Empire. And the Indian Army fought in most of the wars of the 20th century, the First and Second World War. India provided the largest volunteer army in the First World War of any country. And that was true in the Second World War. 2.25 million men and women in uniform from India fighting in all theaters of the war. And this would affect India after the war was over. It explains quite a bit about how the British departed and about the political circumstances under which that happened. Well, within a few years of this very lavish pomp and circumstance coronation durbar in which all the princes of India were in attendance, India was becoming ungovernable because by 1920, the Indian freedom struggle was underway. Now, Indians had been fighting for their freedom for a long time before that, but this was the struggle that was galvanized by Mohandas Gandhi. He was a British-trained lawyer from Gujarat who had become a sannyasi. He had adopted the manner of a Hindu holy man. He had perfected his discipline, his philosophy, and he had returned to India from South Africa just a few years early in the midst of the First World War. Mohandas Gandhi, seen here with his very close friend and political associate, another British-trained lawyer, Jawaharlal Nehru from Allahabad, they led a mass movement And the reason this movement was so successful, not 100% successful, but at least successful in making parts of India ungovernable for the British, was that they were able to tap into the thing that this disempowered population in India had, and that was their numbers. Previous Indian nationalists had never really been able to reach out because often they didn't really appreciate the things that the mass of the Indian population worried about, most of whom were peasants. They worried about rents. They worried about how they were going to feed their families. They worried about police corruption at the lowest levels. And the people in the nationalist movement often tended to live a very elite and privileged life, a lot of it having to do with their relationship with the colonial rulers. But Gandhi changed this. What he also pointed out too, and this is a point that had been made by earlier nationalists, was that the percentage of people in India who were British at any point during British control never exceeded 1%. In fact, it was usually a fraction of 1%. So the British couldn't hold India without the cooperation of the people there. So if the people simply stopped cooperating, then the British would have two choices. They would have to use force to force the compliance of people who had not risen up in an armed revolt. That had happened earlier. Or they would simply cut their losses and realize it wasn't worth staying in India. And eventually that is what happened, but it took a long time. One of the other things that Gandhi was successful in doing, at least for a time, was in reaching out to India's Muslim population. The Indian National Congress, which was the main nationalist organization, was a non-sectarian organization, and it realized that a country as religiously pluralistic as India, with Hindus and Muslims, with Sikhs, with Parsis, who were descended of people who had taken shelter in India after being persecuted in Persia, with Jews who had been in India since before the Common Era, with Christians who'd been in India since the 2nd century, not to mention other religions, Buddhists and Jains and so forth. A country that religiously pluralistic would need a secular government in which all Indians, regardless of faith, regardless of ethnicity, language, would feel like they were citizens. And that was very difficult for some of India's Muslims to accept, only because they realized that there had to be safeguards for minorities, because there's a saying that true democracy is 3 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Right? If those safeguards aren't there, then an imperial power devolving greater power in a democratic form is not going to be something that assures the security of a minority. So Gandhi reached out to the Muslims, who were beginning to look at least political arrangements with the British that would guarantee their security, particularly separate electorates. And Gandhi reached out and for a time brought India's Hindus and Muslims together. And that was the thing that the British really didn't like, because one of the things that Muslims and Hindus worried about on either side was that the British were particularly trying to divide and rule India's population. It's very easy to rule a subdued population if you just set them against each other and then give out concessions from one group or to another, each group having to go to the rulers for those, not working together. Gandhi was able to bring them together for a time, but unfortunately, as the years went by, it became harder and harder to do that. Freedom for India came on August 15th, 1947, very famously at the stroke of the midnight hour, but only after the British had concluded that partition between independent India and the new nation of Pakistan for India's Muslims, South Asia's Muslims, was an unavoidable reality. And a lot of this had been that the British after World War II were in such a weakened position that they actually wanted to get out of India as quickly as they could, realizing that they could no longer maintain control and having a lot of problems elsewhere. One of the reasons why the British were leaving India was that they could no longer control India's military. And they relied very heavily upon India's military to maintain control. And the other thing, too, was that post-war Britain was a country that was in debt, massive wartime debt, to the United States and also to India. They'd borrowed money from the government of India for the deployment of Indian troops who fought in Burma and in North Africa and Italy. And part of it also was that the British had elected the Labour Party after the Conservatives had been in power for about 10 years. And the Labour Party was very keen on granting independence. They were very sympathetic to India. But the one thing that they had to do was they had to hand it over to a country that could govern itself. And the Muslim League, who now represented India's Muslims, if the votes were anything to go by, and the Indian National Congress. They couldn't come to an agreement. And so finally it was decided to partition the country. The partition of India and Pakistan in the summer of 1947 is one of the great tragedies of modern history. If anybody's read about it, it is a heartbreaking story. And it's one that is still felt in both countries. I've just recently returned from India and Pakistan and actually crossed over. I walked across the border from India to Pakistan, going from Amritsar to Lahore. And that history is still very much alive among the people that live there, even though it happened 77 years ago. Cyril Radcliffe, a lawyer from Britain who had never been to India, he was a very respected civil servant. He was brought to India to draw the border between India and Pakistan. There would be Pakistan in the east and in the west. He was given 6 weeks in mid-July to draw a border of two countries that would come into existence in mid-August. Do the math. These two countries came into existence on August 15th without their borders even having been confirmed, been completed. And Muslims and Hindus in the borderland areas, or what would become the borderland areas, they weren't willing to wait to find out what would happen. They thought that they would be massacred by the majority community. In some cases, they were right. And so this led to an exodus of people, anywhere between 10 to 15 million, one of the largest forced migrations in history, and over the course of a few months, really. Those are estimates, by the way. There are people in India and Pakistan who would say that those numbers are actually higher. Some put it as high as 20 million. The estimated dead, anywhere between 750,000 to 1.5 million. It was a tragedy on an epic scale. The cities of Amritsar and Lahore, which are 50 kilometers apart, about, well, certainly closer than Portland and Salem, they'd been twin cities. People went back and forth freely. They were divided, and nowadays, most people in one city will never visit the other. I was fortunate enough to go to both, but I was able to do it. Most people will never do. And of course, this set the tone for the relationship between India and Pakistan, a relationship of hostility between countries that have gone to war, and which is still a hostile relationship. Although, like all things in India and in Pakistan, it's more complex than that. The actual relations between Indians and Pakistanis are often not as hostile as they're made out to be. So here is the map of India before partition. The pink areas are the princely states, the vassal states of princes who could govern their own states. There are about 570 of these altogether, and they gave their fealty to the king emperor. And they got certain privileges in return. And then the areas that are in the kind of yellowish color are the areas that the British directly administered. So Cyril Radcliffe was commissioned to turn this into ultimately what would be this. And he was given 6 weeks to do it, dividing hundreds of millions of people. You could say he did the best he could, but it didn't avoid the tragedy of partition. Here's something else that might interest you. This is another map from 1909 showing the religious majorities in India based on Census of India information gathered by the British government. So that was 1909. And that was the map that they drew. Not identical, but almost. But this information was quite outdated, and Cyril Radcliffe was using information from the most recent census, which was the one in 1941. And 1941 was the middle of World War II. People were on the move. The country was in a wartime footing. Millions of people were being mobilized. Millions of laborers were moving. So the data was not necessarily accurate. But that was partition. And again, it's something I've studied for a long time. And for my recent visit, where I actually went from the border, from this town of Amritsar, crossed the border into Pakistan, and then went to Lahore, two cities that were ravaged by partition. It was amazing to just hear people who themselves didn't live through it. Most people who actually lived through partition would be in their 80s and 90s now, and they would have been teenagers or children. But they're still survivors of it. But certainly their children and their grandchildren, they have relatives that they've never met. If they're lucky, they're of means that they can travel and they have the wealth, and they might be able to meet their relatives in places like Dubai or London or Amsterdam, but they can almost never go from one country to the other, even if they only live short distance apart. Nehru, when he became prime minister at the stroke of the midnight hour, when August 14th became August 15th, Sorry, I'm just looking at my clock. Okay. Gave a famous speech. It's called his Tryst with Destiny speech. He gave it over the radio. All India radio carried it, including broadcast into the areas in the province of Punjab, now divided between India and Pakistan, that were experiencing some of the worst bloodshed in all of South Asian history. And he said, long ago we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. A moment comes which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, and when the age ends, and when the soul of a nation finds utterance. So he said this at the moment that he became Prime Minister of India. Jawaharlal Nehru was a fierce opponent, of British rule, but he himself was a product of the British education system. He had attended Harrow, one of the elite public schools in Britain, and then Cambridge University, and had been given his legal training at the Inner Temple, one of the four Inns of Court in London. He had come back. He was the scion of a political dynasty. His father, Motilal Nehru, had been president of the Indian National Congress. He was a very charismatic person. He was somebody who was sort of made for politics. When he said that India was redeeming its pledge, not wholly or in full measure, that could mean a couple things. It could mean that he had hoped that a united India would emerge from British rule, and that clearly hadn't happened. That was, of course, the great failure, and his close associate, Mohandas Gandhi, felt it was the great failure of his life. He wanted this one country to emerge. He called it the vivisection of a living thing. But there was another way that India hadn't emerged completely, not wholly or in full measure. And that was because in August of 1947, India became a dominion of the British Commonwealth, like Canada or Australia. Self-governing country, but who's the head of state in Canada or Australia? It's the monarch. In this case, it would have been King George VI, the father of the recently departed Elizabeth II. And that's not what Nehru wanted, and that's not what the Indian National Congress wanted. What they wanted India to be was a republic, where the people are sovereign. They could still be part of the British Commonwealth, but they didn't want a monarch ruling them, even symbolically, even if they could do whatever they wanted as their own independent country. But what they needed to do in order to go from being a dominion to a republic was they needed to rewrite their constitution. India had a constitution that had been given in 1935 by the British, but they set out to make a new constitution. And the person that Nehru chose to do it was the perfect choice. It was his close friend and colleague, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. Ambedkar was what at the time, his time, would have been referred to as an untouchable. Today they're called Dalits. The most oppressed of India's people, about 15% of the population, at the very, very bottom of the caste system, doing the most menial jobs, often the poorest communities and the least educated. Ambedkar had been given an education, a scholarship, and his educational career had risen. He received education in India from the very best schools there. And then he went on to get legal training at two different schools in Britain, like a lot of other Indians. And then he went to get a PhD in political science from Columbia University in New York. So one of the most educated Indians, and certainly one of the greatest constitutional scholars in the history of India. And Nehru, of course, thought he would be the perfect choice because Nehru was a secularist. Nehru didn't particularly like religion. Nehru, unlike Ambedkar, had the accident of being born a Brahmin, one of the highest castes, but he wasn't particularly religious, and Nehru certainly had no love of the caste system. He wanted a constitution that would make India a democratic republic with justice, liberty, equality, fraternity. You can see Ambedkar's knowledge of different countries. He wanted the constitution to have the spirit of the French Revolution. It's not just a political change, it's a social and economic revolution. He wanted a federal system of government with states and a central government, modeled very much on the United States. And he wanted a parliamentary system where the prime minister is the head of government and there's a president who's the head of state. The British, I should say the Indian nationalists, they often had a very a very high regard for the parliamentary system of government. What they didn't have a high regard for was the fact that the British never tried to introduce this into India and give Indians the same representation in their country that the British parliamentary system afforded British citizens in the United Kingdom. So he drafted the Constitution. It took a long time to do this. The result is the world's longest written constitution. They began it almost immediately after independence, and 2 years later, in November 1949, it was finally adopted by what was then called the Constituent Assembly. It's now the Parliament of India. And on January 26th, the Constitution went into effect. That's Republic Day, January 26th. It's celebrated in India. And in many ways, it's sort of like their Independence Day, even though they became independent in August of 1947. And part of that has to do with the fact that the Republic really completed the political goals of Indian nationalists. When they became a republic and the people became the sovereign rulers of their own political destiny, that was really the fulfillment. Independence in India is also will always be associated with the tragedy of partition too. So at least Republic Day is something that can be celebrated. And I can tell you also, having lived in India and been there both in August and January, January is a much nicer time to be outside and to celebrate. August, it can still be quite a bit hot. So there's always a big Republic Day parade. So the Republic is established, and this began the era, the Nehru era. But one thing that, before I get into that, one thing that Ambedkar did was he made sure that the Constitution had legal protections for those who might otherwise be oppressed. It is illegal to discriminate on the basis of gender, on the basis of religion or creed, on the basis of ethnicity, and it is illegal to force somebody to do an occupation that they don't want. And that is very much a critique of the caste system, because caste is so much about occupation. Now, obviously, the Constitution makes this illegal, but it can often be very difficult to enforce this, particularly in areas where local tradition and the law enforcement mechanisms are more often in sympathy with the tradition rather than what the Constitution of India provides. And I think the novel gets into this in a very significant way. But he did designate certain groups using the old Census of India categorizations, but some new ones as well. They're called the scheduled tribes or scheduled castes, scheduled if you use the American pronunciation. And they're often given specific they call them reservations, but they're given a certain amount of seats in legislative assemblies and councils. They're given a certain amount of spaces in the civil service and government services, and often in university as well. It's a very controversial policy in India. There are arguments for and against it. But Ambedkar felt very strongly that you can't rely upon people's better angels in the way that Gandhi might have hoped. You have to have enforceable legal protections. Gandhi became an inspiration to other oppressed communities, particularly African Americans in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement. But Ambedkar also, for people who studied it, is important too because of his emphasis on the law. So Nehru now is the prime minister, the logical choice. He had been the leader of the Indian National Congress. He was the most well-known Indian after Gandhi. And he was a political leader in a way that Gandhi never really was. Gandhi was more of a spiritual leader, although Gandhi could be very political. And Nehru, in many ways, was sort of groomed for this from a very early age by his father, who was also a distinguished Indian politician. So this is the beginning of a political dynasty in India. Nehru governed as prime minister uninterrupted from August 1947, the day the country became independent, until his death in office. And what Nehru wanted for his country was he wanted India to chart its own path. 1947 was 2 years after the end of World War II. It was the beginning of the Cold War, which we're familiar with in the United States. And Nehru saw how nations that aligned themselves with either the United States or the Soviet Union often gave up quite a bit of their own political control. I mean, even the United Kingdom, the country that had ruled India, was now very much a junior partner to the United States in the NATO alliance. And the countries that aligned with the Soviet Union were pretty much controlled by the Soviet Union. Just think of countries like Poland or Romania or Bulgaria, the eastern part of Germany during the time. So he didn't want the Indians, he didn't want a country that had fought so hard for its freedom to have to then give it up to either one part of the aligned world or the other. And then the other thing too is that India didn't fit quite naturally with one or the other. because Nehru was a committed Democrat. He believed in democracy. He believed in parliamentary rule in India, which you would think would align him with the United States and the countries of the West. And in that way it might. But Nehru was also a socialist, and he believed in a planned economy, and he wanted top-down control. He nationalized a lot of industries in India, some of them directly controlled by the government. Others were run usually by families that were very powerful, like the Birla or Tata families. They're family industries. They're still around. And he wanted to initiate a series of 5-year plans in India, kind of what the Soviets had done, which, again, very controversial. But it had taken what had been a fairly backward country before the Russian Revolution and turned it into a superpower in the span of a few decades. And he argued that, decades, if not centuries, of economic underdevelopment during British colonial rule required that India accelerate its modernizing in a way that could not be done if you simply allowed the market to function as it would. And he also didn't really like capitalism, free market capitalism. He felt that if he looked at countries in Latin America that had become independent and basically just become economic colonies of the United States, and he didn't want that for India either. And this was his domestic policy, but it aligned very well with his foreign policy. And that was that he wanted India to be non-aligned. India was the largest country to emerge from the experience of colonialism after World War II, but not the only one. Pakistan, and then Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, Burma, now Myanmar, eventually the Gold Coast, now Ghana, and then Nigeria and Kenya and Tanzania and Indonesia. All of the colonies of the European empires were emerging. And with each passing year in the late 1940s and the 50s, there were new countries that were being added to the General Assembly in the United Nations. The world itself was changing. Places that would have been considered the possessions of some European power or another were now becoming countries in their own right, usually with enormous difficulty along the way. And Nehru felt that this was, if you looked at the US and you called it the first world, and then the second world was the Soviets and the communist countries, he described a third world. It's a term that actually a French sociologist had used. But he made it popular, this term, the third world. That popularization of that term, which was never meant to be pejorative, was actually because of Nehru. And he felt that India could in many ways be the guide and a leader of these countries. And when these countries met, they met at a conference in Indonesia in 1956, the famous Bandung Conference. And in attendance were people like Abdul Gamal Nasser of Egypt, who wanted to be the leader of the Arabs, Arab nationalists, which he was for a while. The Indonesian ruler Sukarno, who later became a dictator once the Dutch East Indies became Indonesia. And then Josip Tito of Yugoslavia, who was a socialist but also didn't want his country controlled by the Soviets and managed to do that as well. So non-alignment was the plan for Nehru, but it was often very difficult. The Americans were quite frustrated because they had you're either with us or you're against us in this war against communism. And they felt that Nehru was a bit of a fence sitter. So they tried to kind of lure him because India would have been a very powerful ally. And the United States had diplomatic relations with India, but they always wanted a bit more. They wanted India to come over, and Nehru wouldn't do that. So here are two photographs of Nehru. The person on the right looks like they might be the same, but they aren't. This is Nikita Khrushchev, and that's Dwight Eisenhower. That's at a White House dinner. So that's Dwight Eisenhower. He's not in his uniform anymore. That's Mamie Eisenhower. There's Nehru over on the very right. And then Nehru was a widower when he became prime minister. So his companion is his daughter Indira. More about her in a moment. And non-alignment worked for a while. These countries had to woo India a little bit more. But at the same time, a non-aligned India did not have the protection of one country or another. And this was made painfully clear when China attacked India in 1962, the Great Sino-Indian War, which was in many ways more of a shock to India than its war with Pakistan had been earlier. So non-alignment lasted, and when Indira became the prime minister a few years after Nehru's death, non-alignment kind of went by the wayside. So now, India and Pakistan. This is a photo of the border gate closing ceremony. I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's quite extraordinary. I watched it a few weeks ago, actually, when I was there from the Indian side, and then the next day I crossed over into Pakistan. If you ever get a chance, Just go on YouTube and look at it. It's like, it has the feeling of a rock concert. It's a big spectator event. And I don't know if choreography and dancing is a requirement of joining a military force, but if you're going to be part of this unit, you actually have to be pretty good at it. And it's really quite extraordinary. That photograph there I took of the two flags right after I crossed into Pakistan. India and Pakistan have gone to war with each other for 4 times at least. In 1947 and 48, within weeks of becoming independent, over Kashmir. In 1965, not over Kashmir, but that's eventually what they were fighting over. In 1971, when East Pakistan struck for its independence and became Bangladesh. And then again in 1999, in an area called Kargil. And this, of course, was source of much more concern to the rest of the world because at this point, both India and Pakistan were nuclear powers. So people were worried about a nuclear arms race in South Asia. One of the biggest the biggest obstacles to good relations between India and Pakistan, apart from everything else I've talked about, is that they both claim the region of Kashmir, which had been a princely state during the time of British rule. Strategically very important. The headwaters of the Indus River, which irrigate much of the farmland in Pakistan, originate in Kashmir. And as I say, both countries control it. The Pakistanis control about a third of it after this war in 1947-48, and Indians control about 2/3 in what's now the Union territory of Jammu and Kashmir. I've been to the Indian side, but not the Pakistani side. India and Pakistan claim the entire region. There are parts of it that are controlled by China too, I should add. So that's made it virtually impossible for relations to ever really be very good between India and Pakistan. They've oscillated. Sometimes they've been okay. Sometimes the countries have been at war. But this is always the sore point that never really gets resolved. The fact is, both countries are linked. Even if they're separated politically, even if it's hard to cross that border, their culture, their history, their language, Urdu is very similar to Hindi, their cuisine, and in some cases their families are connected, even if they are divided. India's recent rise as a superpower has made them more focused on China as a rival than Pakistan. Pakistan's not really a threat to India anymore, with the exception of the possible use of nuclear weapons and also terrorist attacks that may originate in Pakistan. But it's often convenient for politicians to use this as a distraction. My experience in talking to these Pakistani friends of mine in Lahore, whose families originated in India, and talking to Indians is that, they generally don't have a problem with each other. People in Lahore and Pakistan, their satellite dishes, watch Indian TV, so they're familiar with each other's cultures. But for politicians, it would be very difficult to really make too many concessions on Kashmir one way or another. And this is an ongoing problem. Nehru died in office in 1964. There was an interim prime minister. But what the Indian National Congress, which had essentially had one-party rule in India from independence onward, what they were doing was grooming Indira Gandhi, who was a relatively inexperienced politician, although she'd been with her father quite a bit, a very shrewd woman. She became prime minister in 1966. This is not the general public electing her. It's a parliamentary system. So the members of parliament choose their prime minister. Indira Gandhi, no relation to Mahatma Gandhi, by the way. Gandhi's a fairly common surname in Gujarat, where Mahatma Gandhi was from. Indira was a widow when she became prime minister. Her husband had died a few years earlier. Nobody really knew what to make of her. She was a bit of an enigma. Some of the old guard among the men in parliament, in the Congress party, thought that they might be able to control her because, the woman would do what the men told her to do. It's a fairly patriarchal society. I think Indira had other ideas. She became, by some accounts, the most powerful woman of the 20th century anywhere, and certainly the most powerful woman in India. She also moved the country further toward outright socialist. She was a much more radical person. So the socialism of her father was moved even further more toward the kind of controlling socialism where the government nationalized a lot of industry and instituted price controls and caps on corporate profits and progressive income tax to try to level the society economically, often in a fairly coercive way. And she was also one of the few leaders in Asia who was extremely critical of U.S. military action in Southeast Asia in the 1960s, particularly in Vietnam. She did not endear herself to Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon. They hated her, I think it's safe to say. And she moved the country away from non-alignment and more toward the Soviet Union. She began to purchase arms for India from the Soviet Union. And so it was clear that India was now gravitating more toward the Soviets. She's most controversial for what later came to be known, well, it was actually called it then too, as the emergency. And that happened in 1975. Indira Gandhi had been prime minister for almost a decade, from 1966 to 75. And the High Court in Allahabad, which is where her family was from, where the Nehru family was from, they found her guilty of election improprieties. And that made her ineligible to be prime minister. This is just a year after Watergate. Richard Nixon had resigned because of something similar in the United States. And she declared a state of emergency. She jailed the opposition, called the reserve police, shut down the press, stopped planes from coming in and out of New Delhi. And so many of her opponents, at least when they were free to say this, which was only a little while longer, said that this is a coup d'etat staged by the sitting prime minister, and that this may be the end to Indian democracy, an experiment that had lasted for 3 decades. Indira said that the restrictions on her as prime minister were no longer allowing her to deal effectively with the twin problems that plagued Indians, and that was inflation and corruption. Corruption was rife at all levels. That often happens in a one-party state. And so she said that she needed to take these extraordinary measures. She needed to suspend democracy in order to save it. Her opponents said otherwise until they were jailed. A lot of members of parliament who were in opposition to her, members of her own party, were jailed. And this lasted from April of 1975, maybe a little bit later, I don't remember the date exactly, until the beginning of 1977, in which she basically ruled, her critics would certainly say as a dictator, but she did manage to get these problems under control in a way that she hadn't been able to before, and she was still very popular with a lot of the population. They often said, India is Indira, and Indira is India. They called her Mother India. She was a widow, so it was like she was married to the nation. And she took on this, the role of a goddess in Indian culture is very important, and she was able to do this quite effectively. She's a very commanding presence if you ever see videos of her giving speeches, and she knew how to wield power. And then in 1977, she called the emergency off and called for a general election. Now, why did she do this? Well, maybe she felt she'd accomplished her goal. Maybe she felt that the population was actually in support of her, regardless of what her critics had said, and that commanding victory for her party would bring her back and would confirm a popular mandate in a way that the emergency couldn't. And maybe, and this sometimes happens when people take on power and shut down the opposition and stifle their critics, is they only hear people praising them because the other voices have been silenced. So they think they're more popular than they really are. They think they're doing a better job. But at any rate, Indira's nemesis, political nemesis, a politician named Morarji Desai, who had been a member of Nehru's government, he led a coalition of everybody who was opposed to Indira. So communists on the left, and Hindu nationalists on the right, conservatives. And they called it the Janata Coalition, the People's Coalition. And their platform was basically, we need to get Indira Gandhi out. And they won. Indira Gandhi stepped down. The Janata Coalition took over and fell apart pretty quickly, because when your goal is to get somebody out and you've achieved your goal before you even take over, what's going to hold everybody else together, especially if they come from such disparate sides of the political spectrum? The Janata Coalition misgoverned India for about 3 years, really couldn't do it. One of the members of the cabinet, a man named Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was the foreign minister, left, and his leaving precipitated a collapse of the government. Elections were called, and Indira Gandhi came back in 1980. And she governed as prime minister from 1980 to 1984. when she was assassinated. She also, and this is particularly noteworthy, added the words secular and socialist to the preamble of the Indian Constitution when it was amended. And that amendment was actually in 1979. So it actually happened during the Janata government. And so socialist, secular, democratic republic from that point on. And there's Mrs. Gandhi there. Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated by 6 separatists in 1984, in October of 1984. And this unleashed a wave of mass violence against Sikhs, particularly in Delhi. And this brings up another theme that I want to talk about. And that's the challenge of holding a country as diverse as India together. At the time of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination, there were no less than 10 armed separatist groups that were calling for independence. The Sikhs wanted their own homeland, which had been divided already between India and Pakistan, and then further subdivided in India. The Tamils in the south, who speak a different language and would argue that they're a completely different civilization, with differences from the north that go back to antiquity, before Westerners ever came to India. They wanted their own country, and they were inflamed by the civil war in Sri Lanka against the Tamil minority in that country too, which they claimed to have ethnic and linguistic ties to. In the northeast of India, which was only connected by a very small land bridge after the partition of East Pakistan and then Bangladesh, they really considered themselves to be part of Southeast Asia. So in places like Assam and in some of the areas in the northeast, there were armed uprisings from time to time. India was able to control them, but it was a real challenge to rulers in India, to the leaders of India, because if they didn't deal effectively with separatism, particularly armed separatism, and allowed violence to occur, then that would send a signal to these other groups too. So it was never only about the thing that they were dealing with. It was always what effect it would have elsewhere. And a particularly violent separatist group of Sikhs who had actually targeted more moderate Sikhs. They took over the Golden Temple, the holiest site of Sikhs in the city of Amritsar, just a few miles from the border crossing that I told you about. And Indira ordered the army to take over, and it was an extremely violent confrontation. And she was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards just a few weeks later. Her son, Rajiv Gandhi, who had never wanted to go into politics, he became the prime minister in a commanding landslide victory for the Congress Party in 1984. He was voted out a few years later, and as he was campaigning from the opposition to become prime minister again, he was assassinated in 1991 by Tamil separatists. It was a suicide bombing, one of the first uses of that notorious tactic. So India and India's political leaders and the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty have paid very, very heavily with their own blood for this. Rajiv Gandhi assassinated, his mother assassinated, Nehru's close friend assassinated, not by a separatist, but by a Hindu nationalist. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. So this is British India. We're familiar with this map. And then this is a map of India today. These are the states of India. Even before independence, sorry, I'm going to do a time check here. Oh, all right, I got to wrap it up. Even before independence, the Indian National Congress knew that they would have to redesign the inner boundaries of India to accommodate the different languages, so that people would not feel that they were oppressed in the same way by the independent Indian government, whenever that happened, the way that they had been by the British, who just simply drew political boundaries based on their own concerns, having nothing to do with India. Nehru reconvened the States Reorganization Committee in 1953, just 6 years after independence. The Indian National Congress had done this as early as 1920, when they were envisioning independence, but it was still a long way off. So a lot of these states are actually almost like small countries. They each have their own language. These states in the south of India each speak a different Dravidian language. In this area here, people mostly speak Hindi, but here they speak Marathi, Gujarati, Bengali, Kashmiri. So a lot of it has to do with language. So this diversity in India, it's represented in the map. And then the economic liberalization of India, which began in the 1990s. There was a saying among Indians during the time of Nehru and Indira. They called it license Raj. meaning that the rule is the rule of the bureaucrats. You need a license for everything. You got on a waiting list for a car, these old ambassador cars. There was a very protectionist economy. They were trying to start up India's industry, and they didn't want it flooded with cheap imports. There were permits to be filled out for everything. It was very, very difficult to do business in India. A lot of Indians, when they went abroad, they found it incredibly easy to run successful businesses in a way that was much more difficult back in India. The government oversaw in the 1990s the beginning of a liberalization, which has continued. They opened up the country to imports. They opened it up to foreign investment, which Nehru had always been very wary about, and Indira especially. And you began to see the growth of a middle class relating now to the kind of globalized service industry, a service economy in India. We're familiar with the Indian call centers, but also the data processing, the design of computer software. This was the beginning of India's rise as an economic superpower. Back in the 90s, the news magazine The Economist had called India the world's greatest underachiever economically. Well, you can't call them that anymore now. India's economy is growing at a rate that's much faster than most other countries. And the World Economic Forum predicts that if things stay the way they're going, that India will be the third largest economy within 5 years. That's remarkable considering where they were at the beginning, but certainly greater consumer choice, more things to buy, a more affluent middle class, a middle class that's been educated in India and then goes abroad rather than getting their education abroad and coming back. And of course, an affluence that's not enjoyed across the country. Poverty has been reduced substantially in India, but there's still quite a lot of it. And so this economic growth has not been enjoyed. And if you go to any major city, and certainly in the rural areas, you'll see that the wealth is not distributed evenly. This is obviously true in a lot of countries, not the least of all ours. But that's a big change. And even in the short time that I've been going to India, so the last 20 years, I've noticed it quite a bit. And then the rise of Hindu nationalism. The BJP was started in 1980 by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, one of the Janata cabinet members. He was a Hindu nationalist. Many of the politicians in the BJP belong to an organization known as the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. That was founded in the 1920s. They believe very strongly that the one thing that holds India together as a civilization is Hinduism. Not just the religion, but Hindu civilization, the epics, the socioeconomic hierarchy. They also believe that India will recover its true self and shed some of its Western accoutrement that the early generation of India's leaders had when they fully embrace this. This goes very much against the secularism and the respect for religious pluralism that's written into the Indian constitution. The BJP, founded in 1980, so there's the current Prime Minister of India, a person who probably has more power than any person in India since the time of Indira during the emergency, a fairly controversial leader. But having been in India, I can tell you a very popular leader too, among many of the people I spoke to. So that's the 1980 general election. Congress is the blue. These are the constituencies in the Lok Sabha. This is the 1984 when the BJP first ran candidates. It's kind of hard to see, but those little specks of orange or saffron, those are the two BJP constituencies. This was the election that was held after the assassination of Indira. 1989, and the BJP, remarkable in 5 years, in the Hindi heartland, fairly conservative Hindi-speaking region. 1991, Congress is back in power, but the BJP now has a political hold and is growing. 1996, all of these other colors are smaller parties that if Congress or the BJP don't get it enough, they don't get a majority, they have to make a coalition. And then in 1998, the BJP, with its coalition partners, some of these are actually in German. The information comes from the Election Commission, but I use a German website for this. This was where the BJP under then Prime Minister Vajpayee was able to form a government only with its coalition partners. In 2004, Congress basically built a coalition that allowed them to form, even though the BJP got the most votes. You can see they're expanding. And then 2009, a return to power in Congress. And then this is when BJP was able to form a government without their coalition partners. They had a majority, and this is when Narendra Modi, the chief minister of Gujarat, became prime minister of India. And this is the most recent election. So the BJP doesn't even have a formidable opposition now. And this has given Narendra Modi an enormous amount of power to rewrite parts of the Constitution, to push through legislation against a fairly supine parliament, and to take some very, very controversial measures, which I can talk about later. And so the next election is going to begin on April 16th of this year. And if the numbers in the last election, of course, India breaks its own record for the largest election in the world. In 2019, there were 912 million eligible voters in India, and there was a 67% voter participation rate, which is much higher than most other countries, and certainly the United States. So Indians are very invested in their elections. The elections usually take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks to complete. The voting goes on for a long amount of time. They use paper ballots. They are monitored very, very carefully. All sorts of electoral shenanigans that have gone on in other countries go on there too. But generally, people respect the outcome of the vote. Indira Gandhi respected the outcome of the vote that kicked her out of power after the emergency in 1977. So who knows what the next election will bring? We have a hard enough time predicting the past. Don't ask us about the future. But we will know the result at the end of June. The prediction is that Narendra Modi will continue, that he will win a victory, the BJP, and that he'll continue as Prime Minister of India. Anyway, so just to give you another sense of how, this is a party that didn't even exist before 1980. All right. I'll wrap it up there. I've gone over. I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much for your patience and for your attention.
Dr. Campion will be happy to entertain questions. Are there any?
A couple thousand years ago, what made them Indian? Did each of these dozens of languages have a version of the word India?
India is actually a European word.
Well, my point being is that all this that is India, what made
That's
one country or one entity?
Well, it was the idea of a nation itself is a fairly modern concept.
Yes.
I mean, this was a civilization or multiple civilizations. There was a civilization in the north of India, in what's now North Indian Pakistan. That was a Bronze Age civilization. In the south of India, they spoke a different language. A lot of it had to do with geography. India is separated from the rest of Asia by 2 major mountain ranges. And so that's tended to kind of keep people when they come in. Also, India, there's a greenhouse effect that makes India much more agriculturally rich than other parts of Asia, certainly Central Asia.
I'm in the middle of reading a book about a man who has been in every single country on the planet over a period of 50 years. And he spent a section on what is a country.
Yeah. Nehru wrote an entire book about what is India. And it really depends on who you ask. But within India, you have regions of India that, in a place like Europe would probably be their own country. As different as Wales is from Bulgaria, or, the Basque country is from Lithuania. That's how different Bengal is from Tamil Nadu, or Telangana is from, Gujarat.
So it's just the geography, the shape, and the climate.
Yeah, I would say that.
Sort of identity of any sort of at all.
Yeah, it's asking what makes an Indian is like what makes a European. But the Indians would tell you a lot of it is, adhering to the values in the Constitution of India. Some will tell you it's Hinduism. Hinduism has been fairly famously tolerant of other religions, but that is the majority religion, and it is a religion that originated in India. And there are a variety of ways to answer that question. Yeah, I don't have an answer. I'm not Indian, so. But every answer I could think of a counter argument against it.
Well, you gave me as close as I was expecting.
Yeah. Yes.
In the early 90s, we were just getting cell phones, and I used to wait till late at night and call in to get customer service.
Yeah.
And I'd wind up in India, and I talked to these guys that spoke King's English. And they were fabulously educated and had worked on the development of the phones. Where did that come from?
Part of it is taking advantage of two things. The sheer number of Indians that have an English medium education and are very well educated, particularly technically educated.
Right.
And then part of it is just the time difference. So if you want to talk to somebody,
How were they educated? By the 90s, were they still being educated by English?
Not by the British, but they were educated in English medium schools. In other words, the schools, they were from India, and the instructors were Indian, although some of the schools had been established before independence, but the medium of instruction was English. So if they spoke Gujarati or Marathi or Bengali at home, they took their classes in English. So they completed their education with English as good as anybody's anywhere. And most people in India are multilingual. They'll speak Hindi, they'll speak English. If they're from a region that doesn't have Hindi.
English.
Well, British Commonwealth English, but it's become much more Americanized, over time, particularly in the interaction with the United States.
One of these guys, I asked him about his education, and he said he wanted to come to America because he was really well educated. He'd been to something he said would be like your MIT.
They're called IITs, Indian Institutes of Technology. They are extremely competitive. I mean, they'll accept 1% or 2% of the applicants. And then, of course, traditionally the hard part is keeping them in India after they graduate because they've recruited around the world. But actually, more Indians are coming back, having worked abroad, and more Indian graduates of IITs are staying in India because the opportunity is there. And part of it is they want to build up their own country now, that there's a sense of optimism. That's certainly palpable in the years that I've been going. India is a fast-growing country. The infrastructure in India is incredible. There are highways, there are airports. It's modernizing at a very fast rate. And a lot of that has just been in the last 10 years, but certainly the last 20 or 30. So, but also in computer software development, in hardware development, in data processing, where, somebody is taken to an emergency room in Phoenix and they have x-rays done or lab results, and those lab results are sent by computer to a physician in India and evaluated, and then the write-up is sent back. And part of it is you can pay them less in India, but part of it is that the quality of what you get is just as good. There's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit in India that would probably not have been able to occur during the time of Indira and Nehru, but certainly now
when
is.
Did she finish?
She was assassinated in 1984, and her son took over. But by then, Congress was losing a lot of its popularity, and they were beginning to go over to this idea of economic.
The second wave of fiber optics was after her, was in the late 80s, 90s.
Yeah. Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated in 1991. There were Congress prime ministers afterwards. The last Congress prime minister was voted out in 2014.
What's the status of the caste system now, currently, and arranged marriages?
The caste discrimination is illegal in India, but it still goes on. It's harder to police in more rural areas, and many of the oppressed people who are the victims of this discrimination they're so poor and their level of education is often so low that they themselves don't even know their own rights. So a lot of NGOs and a lot of organizations will often go and just make people aware of what their rights are. Some lower castes have benefited from the system of reservations and scheduled castes, but generally speaking, they haven't. There's not to take away from our author's book, but there's another book that I highly recommend, and my students read it. It's called Ants Among Elephants, and it's by an untouchable woman. She's a Dalit, but she still uses the term untouchable, and she's a subway conductor in New York City, and a writer, and she wrote her family's history. It's an extraordinary book. It's called Ants Among Elephants, and the author is Sujata Gidla. It's very bad for me to be plugging another book when we're here celebrating this other fine book too, by the way, which I'm sure you've all read. But it does answer that question very well, and in a very personal way. So, yeah.
So the book is about this conflict, let's say, between Muslims and Hindus. To what extent do you think that's continuing, and with the Prime Minister as a...
It's certainly getting more difficult for India's Muslims because the BJP is fairly unapologetic about making Hinduism the primary basis of India's identity. Not that you don't have to be Hindu, but that you don't contribute in the same way. Whereas Nehru and Ambedkar felt that religion was complete. They wanted a kind of American separation of church and state, although obviously that's controversial in this country too. Part of it is also that Modi is very powerful and he's very popular. And so he's doing something that a lot of people in India want. It really is sort of that fear among the minority. I've known a lot of Indian Muslims. I lived in a neighborhood close to Indian Muslim neighborhood in Delhi. And there's a palpable sense of unease among not just Indian Muslims, but also Indian Christians as well. I think the higher up you get, and I mean, this is true anywhere, if you're educated and wealthy and you have connections to the rest of the world, you're not quite as subjected to that. I think the book does show how different life is for people living in villages who don't have necessarily the benefits in life of the protagonist who's educated. But even her own family went through that ordeal in Mumbai, which is based on true events on communal violence between Hindus and Muslims in the 1990s. But I think the book captures it quite well.
Can I ask one more question on Muslims? Doesn't India have the largest population of Muslims in the country?
No, the largest Muslim population is Indonesia. The second largest Muslim population was in India, even though Indians were usually about 20% of the population, just because the population of India was so large. But that's not true anymore. Pakistan has a larger population. Pakistan is almost entirely Muslim.
Wasn't there a feeling for the Muslims to move to Pakistan?
Only in the border areas. Most of India's Muslims stayed put. And Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs, and they generally coexisted fairly peacefully. And they often blame the British for setting them against each other, because it's easier to rule a divided population. That was the argument that Nehru and Gandhi and Ambedkar had made. And that's why they wanted secularism written into the Constitution. Not because India is not a religious country, but precisely because it is. And there are a variety of religions. But most Muslims, the only ones who moved were in the border areas. Or if they felt perhaps that, if they were in government service and they felt that their career might be sidelined. So for example, if you were an Indian Muslim officer in the Indian Army, you might think your career prospects were pretty limited. So you might move to Pakistan and continue your service in the Pakistani army. And if you were a civil servant, you might feel, and you were Hindu, you might feel that your prospects in the government of Pakistan would be limited. And this might explain why the military is such a powerful political force in Pakistan, because so many of these officers went to Pakistan. They were sort of the cream of the crop, the brightest minds. And this might also explain why the military, even though it's stronger in India, is definitely subordinated to the civil government. You're not going to have the military take over in a coup in India. The military answers to the civilian government, but the bureaucrats in India are very, very powerful, the Indian Administrative Service. And that might have something to do with the religious profile of the two countries. That's a theory, though. It's hard to prove one way or another. So, any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Are there any other questions?
As a professor, were you able to teach in any of the universities in India?
I gave a few visiting lectures at two colleges in the south of India, in the city of Tiruchirappalli in Tamil Nadu. One was Bishop Heber College, which is a Diocese of India Christian college. And then the other is St. Joseph's College, which is a Jesuit college. It's Roman Catholic. And I was there as a Fulbright scholar. So I was helping them with curriculum development, but I also gave guest lectures. And yeah.
And how did you like the food?
Oh, I love it. Yeah, well, it's hard. I always tell people there's really no such thing as Indian food. It's like saying European food. There's so many regional varieties, and they're all so good. The food in Hyderabad is among the very best. The food in the south of India is wonderful. In Punjab, if you're a vegetarian, maybe not, but if you aren't, it's wonderful. Bengali food is delicious. Yeah, I think you find that in communities in the United States that have large diaspora populations, you'll get a bit more of that variety. Like you can go to a Punjabi restaurant, or you can go to a Bengali restaurant. This is true in London as well, rather than just kind of the generic Indian restaurant, which is mostly North Indian, but brings in a lot of other things. and is often designed to cater to the tastes of non-Indian, which is to say much less spicy than it normally is. Yeah.